My birthday wasn't supposed to feel like a business meeting, yet that's exactly what it became the moment the projector turned on. I still remember the heat of that bright white beam cutting across the table, washing over the glasses and plates like a spotlight searching for someone to blame. One moment, I was sitting at what I thought would be a simple family dinner, quiet, warm, something small to mark another year. The next, my husband's sister was standing beside a stack of brochures, smiling like she just unveiled a new product line. And maybe she had, just not to the people who came to celebrate me. The room was full of faces I barely knew, strangers she'd invited under the excuse of helping grow her business, all seated at my table, on my night. I could feel their eyes slide past me, not out of rudeness but confusion, as though they were trying to understand why the evening felt off, why the birthday girl looked more like an afterthought than the reason they were there. There's a particular kind of silence that happens when you realize no one asked what you wanted. A hollow, sinking quiet that spreads through your chest as you watch someone else take ownership of your moment. I felt it settle over me as the projector hummed louder, as her voice rose brighter, as my place at the table faded into the background. But that night, what started as an intrusion turned into something else, something stronger. A shift I didn't see coming, but one I needed. If you want more stories like this, quiet, honest, and painfully human, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. I closed the library a little later than usual, the way I often did when someone needed extra help printing a boarding pass or finding a book they couldn't quite describe but hoped I would magically understand. By the time I switched off the overhead lights, my shoulders felt pleasantly tired, the kind of tired that comes from doing small things right. Outside, the air had that faint paper and dust scent that clung to me after long shifts. I slid into my coat, tugged the zipper up, and let out a quiet breath as if settling into myself again. The parking lot was mostly empty, pools of yellow light cast by lamps that hummed like old companions. I carried my bag loosely at my side, not in a hurry. It was one of those evenings that asked for nothing but to be noticed, simple, muted, almost soft. And for a moment, I believed the rest of the night would match it. On the drive home, I swung through the fast food place near the highway, my guilty, crispy little ritual whenever life felt too long or too dull. The neon sign hummed faintly, flickering at the O, and reflected a bluish tint across my windshield. I ordered the fries I liked, the thin, overly salted ones that somehow tasted best when eaten alone in the car with the radio low. When the bag landed in my hands, warm and greasy, I let myself smile. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I thought about my birthday tomorrow, nothing fancy planned, just a quiet dinner, a simple meal, a candle, maybe a call from my brother. I dipped a fry into the tiny packet of ketchup and told myself this counted as a pre-birthday treat, a small celebration for making it through another year, a quiet one, exactly how I preferred it. At the second red light, my phone buzzed. Ryan. Let Claire handle the birthday dinner this year, he'd written. I blinked at the message, letting the words sit untouched for a moment. Claire. My sister-in-law, who loved themes, matching napkins, and conversations that felt rehearsed. She meant well, I reminded myself, just excessively. I reread the text, the fries cooling in my lap, and felt a tiny pause open inside me, thin but undeniable. Letting her plan meant surrendering control, and I wasn't entirely sure why she wanted it, or why Ryan insisted. I typed, okay, because arguing through traffic signals felt ridiculous. Still, as the light turned green and I pressed the gas, something about it pressed back. A faint pressure behind my ribs, like the first note of a song I didn't recognize yet. By the time I reached home, an email from Claire was already waiting. Subject line, "Your birthday dinner confirmed!" Inside was an attached file with decorations and table settings, all color-coordinated, blush pink, gold accents, elaborate centerpieces. It looked more like a bridal shower than a simple dinner. I sat on the couch with one knee pulled to my chest, scrolling through the images. Claire's enthusiasm bordered on theatrical, but I told myself it was her way of being generous. People love differently, I whispered in my head, though it sounded more like an excuse than a truth. I closed the file, set the phone down, and told myself that letting someone else take over could be a kind of gift too, a chance to stop carrying everything alone. Whether or not I believed it yet didn't matter. I wanted to. On the kitchen table, still cluttered with mail I hadn't sorted, sat the small glass candle I bought earlier that week, vanilla with a faint citrus note. I struck a match and watched the wick catch slowly before blooming into a soft gold flame. The room warmed immediately, not in temperature but in tone. Shadows settled where they belonged. I stood there for a moment, hands braced on the table's edge, letting the quiet slip into me like a balm. Whatever tomorrow became, at least tonight held its own peace. I breathed in the scent, subtle and steady, and felt my shoulders unclench. Birthdays were supposed to be gentle, I reminded myself. Maybe this one would be. Maybe. Then the flame flickered, just once, a quick, almost deliberate stutter. Not caused by my breath, not by a draft, just a tiny hiccup of light. It steadied again instantly, but something in the gesture lingered, the way a stranger's glance sometimes does. I tilted my head, half amused by my own reaction. It was only a candle. Still, I couldn't shake the odd sense that the evening had exhaled a hint of warning, subtle enough to miss if I weren't already tired. I pinched the bridge of my nose and turned away, chalking it up to imagination. But the image stayed with me, a small flame whispering that something was shifting, even if I didn't know what. Not yet. The next morning, before I'd even poured my first cup of coffee, another email from Claire slid into my inbox. The subject line was ordinary enough, but the attachment wasn't. Lifestyle Optimization Experience, it read. I frowned, tapping it open. A cascade of polished brochures, bright graphics, and bullet points about unlocking your potential filled the screen. It looked suspiciously like promotional material, energetic fonts, glossy photos of people laughing around glasses of green juice. I sat back, one hand loosely holding my mug, the other hovering above the trackpad. Claire didn't do accidental, not twice in less than 12 hours. I skimmed a few pages, the tone undeniably salesy, and felt the same quiet pressure I'd felt at that red light last night. Something here didn't belong to my birthday, yet it had arrived wearing its name. Before I could make sense of it, a text from Claire popped up. Sent the wrong file, don't mind it. The speed of her message almost made me blink. I stared at it a second longer than necessary, wondering how someone so meticulous, so obsessively curated in everything she touched, managed to send 2 wrong files in a row. A small laugh pushed at my chest, not out of humor but disbelief. I typed, "No worries," because confronting her before breakfast felt like signing up for emotional cardio. Still, the restlessness crept in, a thin thread winding its way up my spine. I closed the email, set the phone face down, and finished my coffee in silence, trying to convince myself the day would return to normal if I didn't tug on whatever this was. At lunch, I mentioned the strange attachments to a coworker while we stood near the break room fridge. She listened, one eyebrow lifting with the kind of skepticism only people who've survived workplace retreats possess. Sounds like one of those MLM pitches, she said, half teasing, half serious. They always start with the exclusive experience. I laughed softly, trying to keep the sound light, but the idea landed more accurately than I wanted. The brochures suddenly made more sense, and that wasn't comforting. She nudged me with her elbow, telling me not to overthink it, but my mind was already circling back around. Claire planning my birthday was one thing. Claire turning it into a marketing opportunity was another, a line too thin to ignore. After work, I stopped by the supermarket to pick up a few things: milk, fruit, a small treat for myself. The aisles were warm and bright, filled with people choosing birthday cakes for children who probably didn't care about the frosting half as much as their parents did. I slowed near the refrigerated section, and ran my fingers along a row of simple chocolate cakes, their plastic lids fogged slightly from the cold. It struck me how easy birthdays could be if you let them be small. I picked up a single-serving cake, the kind meant for one, and held it in my hands for a moment. Not out of loneliness, but clarity. A reminder that celebration didn't need a production team. I set it back gently and walked on, unsure why I suddenly felt protective of something as quiet as a dinner. Ryan called as I loaded groceries into the trunk. His voice carried that familiar weariness, the one that came from juggling everyone's expectations but his own. "I just want things to go smoothly," he said. "Claire's excited, don't worry." The reassurance landed strangely, like a hand patting the wrong shoulder. I leaned against the edge of the car, the cold metal grounding me. "I'm not worried," I said, though the words tasted like compromise. It wasn't fear I felt. It was the sense of being managed, gently but deliberately, as if my birthday were a project on someone else's spreadsheet. He exhaled, sounding relieved, and I told him we'd talk later. When the call ended, I stood still a moment longer, letting the night air settle around me. As I pushed my cart toward the return bay, something fluttered in my peripheral vision. Claire walked past several rows away, heading toward her car, a stack of glossy papers tucked under her arm. I recognized the edge of one, same style, same over-enthusiastic design as the morning's brochure. A page slipped loose and drifted to the pavement behind her. From where I stood, I could make out the words, "Transform your life in 30 days." She didn't notice it fall. I didn't call out. The breeze nudged the page gently across the asphalt, the colors bright under the parking lot lights. I watched it slide, a quiet confirmation of everything I hadn't yet said aloud. Something was definitely out of place this year. Claire called just as I was putting away groceries, her voice bright in that tightly controlled way she used when she wanted something. She asked for a list of my friends so she could confirm the seating arrangement. I paused, carton of eggs still in my hand, the request hanging in the air longer than it should have. It wasn't unreasonable on the surface, but something about her urgency felt off, like she was organizing a conference rather than a birthday dinner. Still, avoiding conflict sometimes felt easier than examining it. So I read off a short list, adding a couple of coworkers who might come if schedules aligned. She thanked me too quickly, as if relieved I hadn't questioned her. When the call ended, I stood still for a moment, feeling as if I'd handed over something more than names. Not even 5 minutes later, an automated calendar invite appeared on my phone. The title made my stomach tighten. Product Experience Dinner. The words sat on the screen like a cold touch. It couldn't be real. Not tied to my name. Not tied to my birthday. I clicked into the details just to be sure. My birth date, the restaurant, the time. Everything was correct. Only the title screamed something else entirely. My pulse clenched. The room felt smaller, as if the air had thickened around me. I set the phone on the kitchen counter, palms pressed to either side, grounding myself on the edge. Whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake. Not anymore. It was a direction, and I hadn't chosen it. I texted Claire, asking about the title. Her reply came back nearly instant. Probably a restaurant template. Ignore it. The neatness of the answer, the speed, the way it landed. Too smooth, too prepared. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, tempted to push further, to name the thing hiding behind all her decorations and file attachments. But questioning Claire was like tugging at a knot she pretended didn't exist. She'd only tighten it. So I erased what I planned to write and closed the chat. My reflection in the black screen of my phone looked almost calm, though beneath it, something restless was taking shape. A quiet understanding that I was being steered somewhere without being asked. Later that afternoon, my best friend texted to check on me. Her messages always carried warmth, even through a screen. I told her about the strange invitation, the emails, the brochures. She replied with a half-joking, "Need me to do your makeup?" Or rescue you if your sister-in-law breaks out a mic? I laughed, but the joke brushed a bruise I hadn't acknowledged yet. The truth was, I didn't know what Claire was planning anymore. A dinner? A presentation? Both? I sat on my bed with my back against the headboard, phone resting on my knee, staring at her message until the humor faded and only the question remained. What exactly was I walking into? I closed the conversation and headed to the kitchen, deciding to make myself a cup of hot cocoa. A small comfort, something that always slowed my thoughts down enough to feel human again. As the milk warmed, a soft sweetness filled the room. I wrapped both hands around the mug and let the heat seep into my fingers, grounding me. I dealt with Claire's over-involved sister-in-law energy for years, but this felt different, bigger, stranger, not really about me at all. It was the quiet realization that unsettled me most. The birthday wasn't drifting off course. It was being redirected with purpose. When I set my phone on the table beside the mug, my hand didn't move away immediately. My fingertips stayed there, pressing lightly into the wood as if waiting for something. Confirmation, maybe, or courage. I watched my own stillness, noticing how calm it appeared, how deceptive that calm could be. A small breath shivered through me, barely there, but enough to make me wonder whether I was preparing for a dinner or bracing for an ambush dressed as one. I lifted the mug, took a slow sip, and let the warmth fill the space silence had carved. The question lingered, unspoken but unmistakable. The message came from a friend around mid-morning. "Why does your birthday dinner sound like some kind of product experience thing?" I reread the text twice, the words tightening something low in my chest. She'd received the invite Claire sent out, apparently with the same odd title and maybe more details I hadn't even seen. My fingers hovered above my phone, unsure of what to type back. It wasn't embarrassment I felt. Not exactly. It was the sharp awareness that whatever I'd brushed aside as coincidence was now visible to others. I stood by the window, the early sun hitting the glass and warming my skin while my mind worked through what this meant. If my friend had noticed, Claire had crossed a line far more openly than I realized. I opened my email again, scrolling to the invite I'd ignored after the initial jolt. There it was, clear as daylight. No template could have mislabeled it so precisely. I stared at the words until they blurred slightly, the unease settling deeper inside me. It didn't matter how many decorations she'd sent, or how enthusiastically she'd volunteered. Nothing excused turning my birthday into an event with an agenda. The realization didn't come with anger. It arrived with a quiet, steady disappointment, like watching someone miss who you really are, even when you've been standing in plain sight all along. I called Claire, needing to hear her voice rather than chase her explanations through text. She answered breathlessly, background noise clattering, bags, boxes, something being dragged across a surface. When I asked about the event title, she sighed dramatically. "You're being too tense," she said. "Everything will make sense tonight." The reassurance didn't feel like reassurance. It felt like deflection wrapped in a smile. I could picture her waving a hand dismissively, already arranging whatever elaborate plan she had in motion. I held the phone between my shoulder and ear, staring at the floor, wondering why she couldn't just say the truth, why she couldn't let this be simple. A text from Ryan arrived minutes later. "Let it happen. Don't ruin the night." I sat down at the edge of my bed, the words landing heavier than I expected. I wasn't trying to ruin anything. I just wanted my birthday to belong to me, not someone else's ambition. It was strange how easily people assumed a woman asking for clarity was ruining something. The message didn't anger me, but it cooled something inside. A shift, subtle but irreversible. I reread it once more, letting the sting fade into a dull throb, then set the phone aside. The silence of the room felt more honest than any reassurance I'd been given that week. By late afternoon, I sat at my vanity, applying makeup slowly, more to steady my breathing than to beautify anything. My hands weren't shaking, not quite, but there was a tension running beneath the surface, a quiet hum I couldn't ignore. I brushed foundation over my cheeks, watching my own expression settle into something composed. I turned off the music, the silence making each small sound, brush against skin, cap twisting back onto lipstick, feel amplified. Preparing for my birthday felt oddly like preparing for an interview, or a stage I hadn't auditioned for. I checked my reflection one last time, telling myself that whatever waited tonight, I could face it. As I reached for my phone, it vibrated 3 times, short, sharp pulses, and then fell silent. No preview appeared, no follow-up buzz, just those 3 vibrations and then nothing. I stared at the screen, thumb hovering, waiting for the notification to show itself. When it didn't, a strange stillness filled the room. For a moment, it felt like standing in a doorway before someone closes it quietly behind you. I slipped the phone into my bag, exhaling slowly. Whatever tonight held, it had already begun shifting long before I stepped out the door. When I stepped into the restaurant, the first thing I noticed was how wrong the room felt for a family dinner. Instead of a cozy table for 10, a long, white-draped banquet table dominated the center, stretching farther than any birthday celebration I'd ever attended. Cloth napkins were folded in sharp triangles, placed with almost military precision. A few small card holders dotted the length of the table, blank for now, as if waiting for labels. My steps slowed. The soft restaurant lighting, usually warm at this hour, felt colder reflecting off all that white fabric. A hostess smiled warmly at me, unaware that my heart had begun to thud harder against my ribs. This wasn't a dinner. It was a setup. For what exactly, I already suspected, though I wished I didn't. Near the far end of the table, half concealed under a draped section of cloth, sat a compact projector. I recognized its shape immediately. The curved lens, the tiny vents along the sides. It hadn't been placed there accidentally. Someone had made an effort to hide it just enough to pretend it wasn't part of the evening. I kept my hands at my sides, gripping the small bag I carried. My throat tightened, the quiet dread settling fully now. A projector meant a presentation. A presentation meant an audience. The realization wasn't dramatic, it was simply heavy, the way truth often is. I stared at it for a moment longer, then forced myself to look away before the anger could shape itself into expression. Guests began to trickle in, except they weren't my guests. Not my friends, not my coworkers, not anyone I could place from any corner of my life. They were strangers, carrying polite smiles and glossy folders. A woman in a blazer nodded at me, as if we were both attending a corporate retreat. I nodded back out of reflex, then stepped aside, a quiet unease pulling me toward the wall. Their chatter floated around the room, light but pointed, filled with rehearsed enthusiasm about schedules, opportunities, and big changes. Each new arrival confirmed what I had been resisting. I was no longer the center of my own birthday. I wasn't even part of the intended audience. Claire appeared near the entrance, adjusting the waist of her dress and smoothing her hair with practiced confidence. She spoke to a restaurant staff member in a hushed but efficient tone, something about timing and seating. The staff nodded obediently. I watched her from a distance, seeing a version of her I'd never paid close attention to before. Someone orchestrating an event, not someone celebrating family. She glanced around the room with satisfaction, unaware I was watching, unaware or uninterested in what this meant for me. A quiet heaviness pressed behind my ribs. I stood still, invisible in my own story. Ryan arrived beside me eventually, placing a warm hand on my shoulder. "Hey," he said softly, as if reading the tension before I spoke. "Everything looks great, right? It's your night." His confidence felt strangely misplaced. I looked up at him, trying to decipher whether he truly believed that, or whether he was playing peacekeeper again, stretching himself thin between loyalties. "It's a lot," I said, keeping my voice steady. He squeezed my shoulder gently, a reassurance meant to anchor me, but the words didn't match the moment. The room didn't feel like it belonged to me. It felt borrowed, repurposed. As we walked toward the table, the projector blinked, a tiny green light pulsing once before settling back into darkness. A faint electrical hum followed, subtle enough that no one else seemed to notice. But I did. The blink felt like a small signal, a soft acknowledgement of everything about to unfold. I swallowed hard, eyes drifting across the room again, taking in the strangers, the equipment, the carefully arranged table. The night had already veered far beyond what I agreed to, and standing there, I knew whatever was coming wasn't going to wait for me to catch up. Claire stepped toward the front of the long table with the kind of confidence people reserve for microphones, event stages, or moments when they believe the world is finally paying attention. She lifted her chin slightly and clasped her hands in front of her, smiling as if this exact scenario, had been her plan all along. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice warm and poised, drifting across the room like she'd rehearsed it. I froze in my seat. This wasn't the tone of a birthday toast. It was the opening line of a presentation. My pulse fluttered, and I felt myself sink a little lower, a quiet disbelief phasing into something heavier. I kept my hands folded beneath the table, hoping no one would notice the stillness I was forcing into them. Across the table, several guests opened glossy catalogs, flipping pages with a familiarity that told me they weren't new to this. Their eyes skimmed the sections with intent: nutrition, skincare, supplements. One woman even nodded approvingly at a photo, as if she'd been waiting for someone to bring it up. I felt heat gather at the base of my neck, rising slowly, the kind that makes you wish you could leave your own body for a moment. My birthday was no longer a celebration. It was a captive audience, and I had somehow become part of the seating arrangement. I pressed my fingers into the napkin on my lap, grounding myself in the texture, because nothing else about this felt steady. I tried smiling, the polite kind people give at weddings or awkward reunions, but the expression felt thin on my face. A woman across from me asked if I'd used the product line yet, her tone friendly but curious, as if I were a testimonial waiting to happen. "Not really," I said softly, but my voice felt swallowed by the room. The stranger nodded, turning back to her catalog without much thought. I looked down at the tablecloth, tracing one of the embroidered patterns with my thumb. Under the surface of courtesy, humiliation threaded itself quietly through me, slow, deliberate, undeniable. Ryan leaned toward me, his shoulder brushing mine. "Give her a few minutes," he murmured, as if Claire's commandeering of the evening were simply a quirk, something I should indulge. His tone wasn't harsh, just tired, like a man trying to keep the peace before anything cracked open. I swallowed the urge to ask why me? Why I had to smooth over something I didn't cause, didn't choose, didn't even understand. His attempt to comfort only made the divide sharper. It wasn't support I needed, it was acknowledgement. But he couldn't see that, not yet. Another guest turned to me and asked, "Have you seen the transformation videos?" I opened my mouth, but no words formed. My throat tightened around a response that never arrived. The room wasn't loud, but every voice around me felt amplified, as if I'd been placed inside a fishbowl where people tapped on the glass expecting me to react. I shook my head gently, forcing a small smile I didn't feel. Inside, something wilted a little, not from anger, but from the realization that I had been turned into an accessory to someone else's ambition. Somewhere nearby, a spoon grazed lightly against a plate, the sound barely more than a whisper. Yet it struck my ears sharply, cutting through the layered chatter and leaving a thin echo behind. I blinked, steadying myself, the noise reverberating in a way no one else seemed to notice. The tiny clink felt like a quiet signal, though of what I hadn't figured out. I exhaled slowly, letting the room settle back into its rhythm while I tried to find mine. But the truth was already clear. The evening wasn't slipping out of my hands. It had never been in them. I didn't hear the beginning of Claire's next sentence. I only caught the shift in her tone, the subtle rise that performers use when they're building toward a personal anecdote. "My sister-in-law," she said brightly, gesturing toward me as if unveiling a surprise. Went through a really tough period last year. Stress, exhaustion, you know how life wears you down. My head snapped up. The room seemed to tilt for a moment. She continued. But after starting this system, she changed. More energy, better mood. I blinked at her, stunned. None of that was true, not even close. But the guests were already looking at me, hoping to see the before and after she was crafting. Their curiosity felt almost gentle, which somehow made the moment sharper. A pair of expectant eyes settled on me, one woman leaning slightly forward, catalog balanced on her lap. I felt their silent request. Confirm it. My mouth opened, but no words came. Instead, I simply shook my head once, slow and small, an attempt to maintain dignity while quietly undoing the false story she had borrowed. The woman blinked, surprised, then leaned back, the narrative she'd been handed suddenly losing its shine. I kept my expression composed, though my chest tightened. I wasn't angry yet. I was stunned, in that calm, unreal way when your own life is being narrated by someone else. Ryan leaned in again, voice low and strained. "She's just trying to help you," he whispered, the words shaped like a plea rather than a defense. I stared straight ahead, unsure what to say. Help me? By fabricating a crisis I never had? By turning me into a case study for people I'd never met? The disconnect was wide enough to fall through. I felt a quiet ache settle somewhere deep, not sharp but present, unmistakable. His hand brushed the back of my chair, steadying himself, not me. I swallowed, feeling the distance between us stretch a little farther. My fingers tightened around the base of my water glass. I set it down a bit harder than I intended, the faint knock barely noticeable over the soft hum of conversation. Still, it anchored me. The table, once simply a piece of furniture, now felt like a barrier, one I needed to keep between Claire's version of me and who I actually was. I straightened in my seat, a small act that didn't change the room, but changed how I occupied it. I wasn't here to perform, and I wasn't going to let her script me into her presentation. My phone buzzed quietly in my lap. A message from my best friend. "Everything okay? Want me to come?" Just seeing her name softened something inside me. I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. If I typed exactly what was happening, she'd be in her car within minutes. I wasn't ready for that, not yet. Not while I was still trying to understand what line had been crossed, and why Claire thought she had the right to step so far past it. My thumb hovered, then withdrew. The message stayed unread. I lifted my glass again, rotating it slowly between my fingers. The movement was slight, but my hand trembled just enough to betray what my face tried to conceal. I stared at the melting ice, watching the thin ring of moisture slide down the side of the glass. Everything around me continued, as if nothing unusual was happening, but inside, the shift was unmistakable. I wasn't just uncomfortable, I was waking up to something. And once awake, it's hard to unsee what stands in front of you. Tania David dimmed without warning, slipping the room into a muted dusk. A mechanical click followed, then a soft whir, and suddenly a bright rectangle of light burst across the tablecloth. The projector had been switched on. Its glow washed over the white fabric, casting moving shapes and colors onto the silverware and glasses. I felt the heat of it on my cheek, the brightness too sudden, too invasive. A polished corporate logo appeared, sleek, modern, unmistakably tied to the glossy brochures Claire had been distributing. The light crawled up the walls, reflecting off faces that were suddenly alert, attentive. I sat there, caught in it like an object under inspection, a part of the scenery rather than the person being celebrated. The room held its breath, as if the evening had finally revealed its true purpose. Soft applause rose from a few guests, small, tentative, as though they weren't sure whether to commit but did anyway. It sounded nothing like the warm clapping that happens at birthdays. It felt transactional, anticipatory, the kind of applause given before a keynote speaker takes the stage. I couldn't help tracking how seamlessly everyone slipped into this new rhythm, as if they'd been waiting for it, as if my birthday had merely been an excuse to gather them here. My stomach tightened. The celebration I'd pictured, the quiet dinner, the gentle conversations, had been replaced by something orchestrated and rehearsed. And as the applause faded, I realized I wasn't even part of the moment. I was a bystander in a room that had mistaken itself for a seminar. Claire stepped in front of the projection beam with a bright smile, her shadow stretching long across the table. "Tonight," she said, "is about opportunity, about choosing a new direction." Her voice carried a confidence that made the hairs at the back of my neck stand up. She gestured toward the images behind her, before and after photos, charts, enthusiastic testimonials. I sat frozen, feeling the spotlight brush over me each time the beam shifted. It didn't matter that the lights were dim. The intensity of the moment made everything sharp. I watched Claire's enthusiasm swell, the room bending toward her with unsettling ease. She hadn't just repurposed my birthday. She had erased it. Ryan's eyes flicked toward mine, something uneasy settling behind them. For the first time that night, he didn't look composed. He looked startled, as if he'd expected something intense but not this overt, not this theatrical. He shifted in his seat, fingers tapping faintly on the table as if searching for a rhythm that could steady him. When he leaned my way, his voice was nearly a whisper. "I didn't know she'd go this far." The honesty in his words didn't fix anything, but it cracked open a small truth. He was realizing it alongside me. I couldn't respond. My breath felt caught between disbelief and the urge to walk out. The chair beneath me felt suddenly too hard, too still. I pushed back slightly, letting space open between me and the table. The air around the projector was warm, almost stifling, and the light cast sharp angles across the plates and glasses. My heartbeat felt loud in my ears, thudding with a rhythm out of sync with the low hum of the machine. I stared at the glowing screen, unable to pretend anymore. This wasn't ignorance or misunderstanding. It was a choice Claire had made, bold, intrusive, and stunningly self-serving. For the first time all night, my hands trembled openly. Then the projector's beam shifted, sweeping across the table and landing directly on me for a moment, bright enough that I had to narrow my eyes. It felt almost intentional, though I knew it was just the repositioning of the device. Still, the impact was the same, a sharp, intrusive glare that made my breath hitch. I lowered my gaze, my fingers curling around the edge of my chair. No one else seemed to notice the moment, but I felt it in my bones. Something within me clicked, a quiet realization snapping into place. The night had crossed an unseen boundary, and I could no longer pretend it hadn't. The moment I slipped through the restaurant doors and into the parking lot, the night air hit me with a sharp, bracing cold. I leaned back against my car, letting the metal press coolness through my dress. For the first time in what felt like hours, I inhaled without having to push past the heaviness in my chest. The hum of distant traffic replaced the manufactured warmth of the dining room. My breath fogged lightly in front of me, as if marking proof that I was still here, still separate from the chaos inside. I closed my eyes for a second, feeling the relief settle in tiny waves. The contrast between the crisp night and the suffocating room made everything sharper, cleaner. Out here, I wasn't being watched or packaged into someone else's narrative. I could simply breathe. My hands were still trembling slightly as I unlocked my phone. I typed the first few words to my best friend, "You won't believe what's happening," and then paused. Even in text, the situation felt surreal, almost absurd. I hit send anyway. My fingers were cold, moving a bit clumsily across the screen. Under the parking lot lights, the message bubble glowed with the same pale blue hue as the sky just before dawn. I hugged my arms around myself, not entirely sure whether I was shaking from the cold or from the emotional whiplash of the evening. Everything inside me felt stretched thin, too tightly wound to settle. My phone buzzed almost immediately. She was calling. I answered, hearing her voice filled with concern before I even said hello. "Are you okay? Do you want me to come get you?" The sincerity in her tone cut through me more sharply than anything Claire had said. I tried to explain, stumbling through sentences about the projector, the strangers, the way Claire had turned the dinner into a full-blown pitch meeting. My friend exhaled hard, the sound mixing frustration and disbelief. "Leave," she said gently. "You don't have to stay." Her words hit a soft place inside me, loosening something I hadn't realized was clenched so tightly. I stayed quiet after her suggestion, looking out at the row of parked cars reflecting the streetlights. The idea of leaving was tempting, clean, simple, and undeniably deserved. But leaving also meant something else, acknowledging that the night had broken past fixing, and I wasn't sure I was ready to name that yet. Instead, I told her I just needed a few minutes. She understood immediately. She always did. When we hung up, the silence returned, wrapping itself around me with a strange comfort. I tucked my phone into my coat pocket and exhaled long and slow, watching the breath fade like a small ghost. To ground myself, I opened the car door and reached for the small paper bag I'd left on the passenger seat earlier, the leftover fries from the night before. They were cold now, limp, but I took one anyway and bit into it. The absurdity of eating a day-old fry in the middle of a parking lot while my own birthday was being hijacked a few feet away made me laugh under my breath, a short sound that was half humor, half ache. It was a moment so ordinary and so ridiculous that it softened the heaviness inside me. Sometimes life hands you a symbolic breakdown. Sometimes it hands you a soggy fry and asks you to keep going. As I leaned against the car again, chewing mechanically, the restaurant door behind me clicked open. The sound was small, almost polite, but it sliced through the quiet. I didn't turn immediately. Instead, I let the noise settle into the night, unsure whether it signaled someone entering or someone coming out. For a moment, everything stilled. My breath, the air, even my thoughts. I straightened slowly, bracing myself without knowing for what. The evening had already shifted so many times that another surprise felt almost inevitable. When I stepped back inside, the first thing I noticed wasn't the projector or the strangers or even Claire's steady voice. It was the candle on the center of the table, its flame leaning sharply to one side, pushed by the heat radiating from the machine. The warm glow no longer looked peaceful. It flickered in agitation, stretching and shrinking in uneven waves. I walked toward the table, my footsteps soft against the carpet, and felt the strange sense that the room had rearranged itself in my short absence. The air was warmer, thicker, pulsing with the hum of equipment. Every shift of light bounced across polished glassware like tiny warnings. As I neared my seat, the candle's glow trembled again, casting a ripple across the tablecloth that mirrored the unsettled rhythm inside my chest. Claire was mid-sentence, her enthusiasm sharpened to a pitch that made it clear she had gained momentum while I was gone. She stood close to one of the guests, pointing at a page in the catalog with the urgency of someone trying to close a deal before the moment slipped away. Her eyes shone, not with warmth, but with ambition. She didn't notice I'd returned. Or maybe she did and didn't think it mattered. I stood there for a few seconds, watching her animated gestures, the quick nods from the stranger across from her, the subtle lean-in of someone ready to be convinced. It was surreal to see my birthday, my own quiet celebration, reduced to background noise in a sales pitch. I let myself observe the scene without moving closer. Every detail felt exaggerated. The clink of silverware, the faint buzz from the projector, the shifting shadows across the walls. Claire's voice rose and fell with practiced confidence, shaping the room into something that revolved around her alone. My seat at the table, once meant to be the center of a birthday dinner, felt like a placeholder now, a token gesture rather than a space made for me. A slow understanding settled in. She wasn't just ignoring the boundary, she didn't even know it existed. Or worse, she didn't care. I breathed in, feeling the realization settle with unexpected clarity. Ryan noticed me first. He touched my arm gently, nodding toward an empty chair as if asking me to sit. His gesture was familiar, soft, trying to sew together a wound he couldn't see the shape of. I shook my head, a small motion but firm. His brow creased with confusion, maybe even concern, but he didn't push. For the first time that night, I didn't shrink beneath his uncertainty. I simply stood my ground. The room hummed around us, forks clinking, voices murmuring, Claire's pitch continuing uninterrupted. Ryan exhaled and leaned back in his chair, the unspoken question settling between us like a weight neither of us was ready to lift. I pulled out my phone, its cool surface steady in my hand. My thumb hovered over the screen for a moment, tracing the edge before I opened my email. The list of guests Claire had invited stared back at me, names I'd given her in good faith, believing she would use them for seating arrangements, not recruitment. The clarity of the moment crystallized like cold air. I scrolled slowly, taking in the list as if seeing it for the first time. I wasn't preparing to lash out. I wasn't planning revenge. I was simply acknowledging something I'd ignored for too long. If she could rewrite my birthday, she could rewrite anything. And I couldn't let her keep doing it. I typed one clean line and forwarded the email. Sent this by mistake. Sorry. The words were polite, almost gentle, but the decision behind them was firm, rooted. When I hit send, the soft whoosh of the message leaving felt like the quiet sound of a door clicking shut. Not loudly, not violently, but definitively. I locked my phone and placed it in my bag, my breath steadying for the first time all night. The candle on the table flickered again, less wildly this time, as if it finally understood the shift with me. I kept my phone in my hand for a moment after sending the email, feeling the faintest tremor fade from my fingers. The list of contacts remained on the screen, each name a reminder of how easily I'd trusted Claire to handle something simple, something personal. I scrolled upward again, as if the clarity of my decision needed one last confirmation. My thumb steadied itself in a way that surprised me. The room around me hummed with the same bass of conversations and clinking glasses, but it no longer overwhelmed me. It only emphasized how detached I had become from the chaos. I thought about the people who would see my forwarded message, the unfiltered truth of what had been done with their invitation, and felt no guilt. I felt only the cool certainty that the line had already been crossed long before I chose to respond. A memory surfaced, Claire bragging once about how her competitors in the business hated her efficiency. She'd said it lightly, laughing over drinks, but even then I remembered thinking the pride in her voice didn't sit right. She loved being the standout, the one who could pull a crowd together with a vision only she could see. And now, watching her orchestrate my birthday like a product launch, the pieces of that memory rearranged themselves into a clearer pattern. I pressed my lips together, my jaw tightening just a little. Maybe this night wasn't the beginning of something. It was the middle of a long thread I'd finally pulled taut enough to see. I hit forward again, not to send another message, but to remind myself I had made a choice. There was no anger in the movement, only intention. A small, deliberate act in a room filled with noise that wasn't mine. The simple push of that button felt like reclaiming a piece of ground I hadn't realized had been taken. I exhaled through my nose, the tension in my shoulders loosening for the first time since I walked into the restaurant. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't pettiness. It was balance. Finally tipping back toward something fair. I straightened, placing the phone face down on the table, the soft click of it meeting the wood a quiet punctuation. I added a short line to the forwarded email, a kind of polite shield. Sent this by mistake. Sorry. The phrase looked almost gentle on the screen, though the truth beneath it was anything but small. I reread the words, once, twice, noting how they held equal parts civility and boundary. My thumb hovered for a moment, but I didn't hesitate long. I tapped send, watching the message disappear in an instant. A faint buzz traveled through my hand, the kind that comes when your body realizes you have finally done something you should have done long before. The room seemed to pause with me, though I knew it was only my own heartbeat slowing into something steadier. My best friend texted again, her name lighting up the screen with a warmth the rest of the room lacked. "You good?" she wrote, followed by a second message I wasn't expecting. "Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you." The corners of my mouth softened into a small, unspoken smile. It was such a simple line, yet it filled a space inside me that had been growing hollow all evening. I typed back, "I will be." Then I locked the phone and sat up straighter, feeling my breath settle. My friend's words lingered like a hand on my shoulder, steadying, familiar, and quietly certain. The email swished away, a small sound swallowed by the low murmur of the room. But I felt it, in the air, in my posture, in the subtle shift of my thoughts. It was the sound of something moving forward, something no one else in the room could hear or see yet. I lifted my chin slightly, letting my gaze settle on Claire across the table. She was still mid-pitch, still determined, still oblivious to what was unfolding just out of her line of sight. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt present, more present than I had all night. A quiet certainty settled into me, like a stone finding its rightful place. The reply came faster than I imagined. My phone vibrated once, then again, a brief flutter against the table. I turned it over and saw the name. Someone I barely knew but recognized from Claire's stories, her so-called competitor. The message was short. "I'm nearby." 2 words that held the kind of precision Claire claims she mastered, only now it was pointed back at her. I blinked, absorbing the weight of it. I hadn't expected a response, much less a near immediate one. My pulse jumped slightly, not out of fear but from the quiet realization that whatever Claire had built tonight, she no longer controlled its outline. I slipped the phone into my bag, letting the silence inside me deepen. When I stepped back into the dining room, Claire's face lit up. She mistook my expression for surrender, some softening she thought she'd finally earned. Her relief was so open, it almost made me pity her. Almost. I sat down slowly, feeling the chair cool against my back, and folded my hands in my lap. Claire's smile widened, her posture straightening as she continued her pitch with renewed confidence. She didn't know the shift happening behind her. Not yet. I watched her for a moment, her gesture smooth, her voice bright. For the first time, I saw how fragile that confidence really was, how much it depended on attention that didn't belong to her. Above us, one of the ceiling lights flickered, a brief pulse, barely noticeable unless someone was already watching for signs. The moment passed quickly, but it carried a strange electricity through the room. Conversations paused for half a second, then resumed. Claire kept talking, pretending not to notice the shift in atmosphere. I felt myself lean back slightly, taking in the space with a new kind of calm. The room didn't feel overwhelming anymore. It felt like a stage, right before a curtain lifts. Still, expectant, just waiting for the next cue. I breathed in quietly, my heartbeat settling into a steadier rhythm. I straightened in my chair, allowing a stillness to settle over me. Claire was too absorbed in her presentation to sense anything different, but I felt it. The balance was shifting in ways she hadn't anticipated. My hands no longer trembled, my breath no longer felt shallow. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even anxious. I was simply ready. Ready for the truth to land wherever it needed to. Ready for her to see what she had refused to hear from anyone else. I didn't need to say anything aloud. The room itself felt poised for the moment to unfold. A strange steadiness filled me, quiet and firm. The sound of the restaurant door opening cut through the chatter, soft but unmistakable. A figure stepped inside, pausing briefly to scan the room. The competitor. She carried herself differently, measured, self-assured, with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Claire turned at the sight of her, and the brightness drained from her face in an instant. Her posture faltered before she managed to catch herself. Guest looked up, unsure of who the newcomer was or why she walked with such deliberate calm. The room shifted, subtly but unmistakably, as conversations thinned into silence. Another flicker from the ceiling light followed, sharper this time. The newcomer approached the table with the grace of someone accustomed to unsettling a room by simply entering it. Claire's voice cracked slightly when she greeted her, too high, too quick. I watched from my seat, breathing evenly, letting the moment unravel at its own pace. The air held a clarity I hadn't felt all night. Whatever was supposed to happen next had already begun the moment that door opened, and I no longer needed to navigate around Claire's performance. I simply watched the truth arrive, quiet, undeniable, and exactly on time. A hush settled over the room as the newcomer took a slow step forward. The strangers, Claire's guests, turned in their seats, whispering quietly to one another. None of them understood what was unfolding, but they sensed something shifting. The tension moved through the air like a thin current, subtle yet unmistakable. I watched their faces as confusion slid into curiosity. They didn't know the history here, the long trail of competitiveness Claire had paved with charm and ambition. But they could tell this woman wasn't part of any birthday celebration. The silence tightened, as if the room itself was waiting to hear the first word in a conversation no one had planned to witness. The competitor reached Claire with a polite smile, the kind that held more edge than warmth. "Did you invite the right people tonight?" she asked lightly, but the words carried a deliberate sting. Claire's lips parted, then closed again, her composure slipping for the first time. She stuttered, something between an explanation and a denial, but her voice couldn't find a steady footing. The competitor tilted her head, studying her with the cool detachment of someone accustomed to interruptions, someone who didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. The question hung between them, gathering weight, drawing the guests even further into the quiet spectacle. Claire attempted a smile. It's a family birthday dinner," she said, though the words sounded brittle, like glass under pressure. Her eyes darted toward the table, toward the brochures, toward the projector humming on low in the corner. It was all still there, every detail of her setup betraying her explanation. I saw the shift happen in her expression, the realization that the facade was cracking, that she could no longer steer the story she'd worked so hard to control. Something wilted in the space between her words, something fragile and painfully human. I watched from my seat, feeling both outside the scene and deeply threaded into it. The competing stories, the one Claire crafted and the one unfolding now, collided right in front of me. A strange mix of emotions swirled through me. Disappointment, clarity, and yes, a flicker of relief. Months of uneasy interactions, small comments, subtle dismissals, all of them clicked into place like a puzzle finally showing its image. This wasn't just about tonight. It was about the way my presence had been rewritten, repurposed, reshaped to fit someone else's ambition. And now, for once, she had to face it in full light. A brochure slipped off the table, landing near my feet. It fell open to a page advertising the most expensive package. Sleek photos, bold claims, promises that sounded more like wishes than reality. I bent down and picked it up, flipping it closed with a quiet snap. The gesture wasn't dramatic, but it felt like sealing a lid on a story that had gotten far too loud. I placed it gently back on the table. No one noticed except perhaps one guest who stared at me, uncertain whether to smile or look away. I simply offered a calm nod, as if saying everything was exactly as it should be. When I lifted my eyes, the room had gone still again. Claire stood frozen, caught between maintaining her image and acknowledging the truth pressing in from all sides. The competitor watched her with steady patience, and I remained seated, silent, taking it all in. My stillness felt intentional, an anchor in a room that had started spinning long before anyone realized it. Whatever Claire thought tonight would become, it wasn't this. And whatever I had expected, I knew now that I wasn't the one unraveling. I was simply witnessing what had already been unraveling for a long time. A staff member approached the long table, moving with a quiet firmness that cut through the suspended tension. He stopped near Claire and cleared his throat gently, his posture respectful but steady. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice low enough not to startle anyone. "Restaurant policy doesn't allow promotional presentations in the dining area." A simple sentence, meant to enforce a rule, but it landed with the force of something far larger. Claire froze. Her hands, which had been gesturing only moments earlier, fell to her sides. The guest shifted uncomfortably, glancing from the staff member to the projector, suddenly aware of just how out of place the whole setup looked. I felt a quiet wave move through the room, a subtle resetting of balance. The guests whispered among themselves. "Is this a birthday or a workshop?" one murmured, not unkindly but with genuine confusion. Another looked toward me as if I might provide context, but I simply held her gaze and then looked away, offering nothing to smooth the edges of the moment. Their voices were soft, but each word drifted across the table with unmistakable clarity. The evening had stepped out of the shadows of assumption and into full view, and no one could pretend anymore, not even Claire. The murmurs felt like a chorus naming the truth she had worked so hard to disguise. The competitor stepped closer, her expression politely neutral. "Do you have the right permissions for tonight?" she asked Claire, her tone smooth but carrying a quiet edge. The question, posed so simply, struck a deeper chord than any confrontation could have. Claire's mouth opened, but the explanation she tried to form collapsed under its own weight. It was supposed to be," she stammered, gesturing weakly toward the table, the projector, the scattered brochures. Her efforts looked less like control and more like scrambling. I watched her carefully, noticing how her shoulders tightened, how her breath caught at the base of her throat. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. The room was speaking for me, the truth unfolding without pushing or anger. I sat upright, hands resting lightly on the table, letting myself occupy the moment fully. It felt strangely dignified. I wasn't angry anymore, not in the way I had been earlier. Instead, there was a quiet understanding settling in. The kind that comes when you realize you don't have to argue for your place. You just have to stop moving out of the way. My stillness was its own statement, and even Ryan glanced at me with a kind of wary respect. Ryan looked between Claire and the guests, his expression crumpling slightly with disappointment. He wasn't angry at her, not fully, but he wasn't comfortable either. The weight of the evening pressed into his shoulders, rounding them in a way that made him seem smaller for a moment. He ran a hand through his hair, watching the chaos unfold with a helplessness he rarely showed. I felt a strange tenderness for him, someone caught between loyalty and clarity, trying to protect people who weren't protecting themselves. He didn't say anything, but the apology in his eyes lingered, quiet and earnest. The staff member placed a printed receipt on the corner of the table, the sound of it hitting the surface sharper than it should have been. The bill lay there like a quiet declaration that the night was no longer being shaped by Claire's plans. Conversation stalled. Even the hum of the projector seemed to dim. Claire stared at the paper as if trying to absorb its meaning, her composure visibly slipping. The room held a fragile stillness, one that felt neither chaotic nor calm, just truthful. And beneath it all, I felt something settle deep inside me, the unmistakable sense that the evening had begun shifting towards something inevitable. Ryan touched my elbow gently and motioned toward the hallway just outside the dining area. His expression held a careful mix of urgency and hesitation, the kind that told me he'd reached a point he could no longer ignore. We stepped into the quieter corridor, where the soft overhead lights cast long shadows along the wall. For a moment, he didn't speak, just breathed in, as if trying to steady himself. "I know," he finally said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know she's overboard sometimes." His voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't rehearsed. It sounded like the truth, one he'd been storing somewhere deep and uncomfortable. I stared at him, surprised not by the admission itself, but by how long it had taken to surface. "You've never said that before," I replied quietly. The words came out steadier than I expected. Ryan's shoulders slumped a little, as though he'd been waiting for me to say it, not to accuse him, but to name what had been unspoken between us for years. "I didn't want to make things harder," he murmured. "For anyone." His eyes drifted toward the dining room, toward the soft chaos Claire had left behind. "I just wanted the night to go smoothly." I let out a slow breath, the weight of his explanation pressing gently against an ache I hadn't known how to articulate until now. I shook my head, not in anger, but in recognition of something we had both allowed. "But at what cost?" I asked. My voice wasn't sharp. It carried a tired softness, the kind that comes after too many compromises made in silence. Ryan didn't answer. His gaze dropped to the floor, and for the first time that night, he looked smaller, human, torn. He leaned against the wall, the faint thud of his shoulder settling into the drywall, like he needed it to hold him upright. That small vulnerability softened something inside me, even as disappointment tightened around it. The hallway was quiet, except for distant clinking from the dining room. The sound floated toward us, delicate but insistent, like the world reminding us that the night hadn't paused just because we had stepped aside. I found myself studying Ryan's expression, the fatigue in his eyes, the apology living somewhere beneath it. He wasn't the villain in this story. He was a man stretched thin by loyalties he didn't know how to balance. I felt a pang of sympathy, though it didn't erase the hurt. It simply made the moment more real, more raw, more painfully familiar. There was a tenderness in the silence between us, even as the truth settled with its own weight. "I just wanted peace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded slowly. So did I. My words were simple, but they carried years of trying, years of yielding, smoothing over, letting smaller battles slide in the hope that the bigger ones wouldn't form. Now here we were, two people standing in a hallway, finally acknowledging a truth that should have been addressed long before tonight. Ryan exhaled, a sound full of defeat and relief at the same time. From the dining room, a faint metallic chime drifted outward, the sound of a spoon tapping a cup, soft but unmistakable. It carried through the hallway with eerie clarity, like a tiny reminder of the world we'd stepped out of, but weren't finished with yet. Ryan closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with a look I hadn't seen before, something between acceptance and determination. I straightened my posture, feeling a quiet resolve settle into my bones. Whatever conversation waited for us back in that room, I no longer felt alone stepping into it. When we returned to the dining room, the energy had shifted. Guests sat uneasily, some thumbing through brochures they no longer seemed enthusiastic about. Claire hovered near the projector, trying to look composed, but failing to hide the stiffness in her shoulders. I walked past her without speaking and approached a smaller table in the corner, one the restaurant had set earlier for walk-ins. "Could we separate our family seating?" I asked the nearest staff member, my voice steady. He nodded without hesitation, relief flickering in his expression, as though he'd been waiting for someone to restore sense to the evening. He and another server moved quickly, pulling a few chairs together, clearing away the remnants of the sales setup. For the first time tonight, Something in the room aligned with who I actually was. My best friend, who had arrived just minutes earlier after sensing more than I texted, slipped into the seat beside mine. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply sat close, her presence soft and grounding, the kind of support that required no performance. I exhaled quietly, feeling warmth return to my chest. The murmur of the large table faded behind us, replaced by the familiar ease of someone who knew how to steady me without trying to fix anything. We shared a small look, half concern, half amusement at the absurdity of it all. Somehow, in this separate corner, the night felt like it belonged to me again. Claire glanced over, her expression a storm of irritation and something else, something like envy. She stood frozen for a moment, watching the staff set down clean plates at our table. The contrast between her carefully crafted production and this quiet, improvised corner must have unsettled her. I didn't meet her eyes. I didn't owe her that reassurance. She had built a world tonight where I was expected to be a prop, and stepping out of it left her gripping at empty space. Her frustration hovered in the air, but it no longer touched me. I didn't say anything to Claire as I sat down. Silence, I realized, held more truth than any speech I could have offered. My absence from her stage was all the boundary I needed. Ryan moved toward us, hesitation in every step, as though choosing the wrong table might fracture something permanently. After a moment, he pulled out a chair beside me. He didn't justify his choice. He didn't apologize. He simply sat, the quiet click of the chair legs against the floor sounding like a small declaration, one that felt long overdue. Ryan shifted slightly closer, his presence warm but unsure. "I'm here," he said softly, the words carrying a sincerity I could feel more than hear. I nodded once, accepting the gesture without absolving anything. This wasn't about sides. It was about alignment, about finally refusing to contort myself to fit into other people's expectations. Around us, the restaurant carried on with its ordinary clatter. Silverware against plates, low conversations, the occasional burst of laughter from another table far removed from our strange evening. I let those sounds steady me, letting them become a kind of quiet backdrop to my own reclaimed space. Across the room, the candle on our newly formed table burned with a steady, unbothered flame. Nothing swaying, nothing bending. It glowed gently over the clean plates and untouched water glasses, casting a softness the large, chaotic table no longer held. I rested my hands on the table, feeling a sense of grounding settle into my bones. The night was far from over, but this small claim of space, felt like the first honest step I'd taken all evening. I breathed in, slow and even, knowing the next conversation would matter, and I finally felt ready for it. Back at the long table, Claire tried to recover her momentum. She stood near the projector, voice thinner now, attempting to speak over the shifting atmosphere. Only a handful of guests remained close by, listening out of politeness rather than interest. Her words trembled, not enough for anyone to call her out, but enough for the room to feel it. She held up a brochure with a forced brightness, but her tone cracked on the edges. Watching her struggle to keep a narrative alive felt surreal. This was the same woman who had walked in brimming with confidence, expecting applause and compliance. Now her ambition hovered like a defeated shadow behind her. I didn't look away. I didn't soften. I simply witnessed her fight to maintain control over something that had already slipped from her grasp. I stood and walked toward the front of the table, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that made the nearby guests straighten in their seats. I approached one of the servers and asked, "Could you please turn the projector off?" The request was quiet, steady, and final. The server, who had been eyeing the machine nervously for some time, nodded without hesitation. A soft click sounded as the image on the wall dissolved into darkness.
The sudden absence of the bright beam felt like a breath finally released. A few guests exhaled softly, as though relieved they no longer had to pretend interest. The room shifted once again, not chaotically, but into something calmer, more aligned. With the projector gone, the lighting returned to something gentler. The harsh shadows lifted, revealing a room that hadn't felt like a birthday dinner for hours. I stood still for a moment, letting the normalcy settle around me. The decision to intervene hadn't come from frustration. It came from recognition. The evening could no longer continue on Claire's terms. I sat back down at my smaller table, the separation now in full view. Claire's gaze snapped toward me, sharp with disbelief, maybe even embarrassment. She had expected resistance to come with drama, but quiet resistance, I realized, disarmed her far more completely. Claire approached, her steps slow, as if she wasn't sure whether to confront or retreat. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice soft but wounded.
Her eyes pleaded for a version of the story that didn't cast her as the one who had crossed a line. I met her gaze with a calmness I didn't know I could carry. "Because this is my birthday," I said. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They landed between us like a simple truth, one she had forgotten, or maybe chosen to ignore. She blinked, her expression tightening in a way that looked like defeat rather than anger. For the first time all night, I watched her facade falter entirely. Claire's lips parted as if to argue, but nothing came. The guests, now quieter and seated farther apart, pretended not to watch, though their silence gave them away. The competitor stood near the entrance, arms folded loosely, observing with the kind of detached interest that comes from witnessing consequences unfold naturally. Ryan shifted beside me, his face softened with something between pride and apology. I felt the emotional distance between me and the chaos widen, not as an escape, but as a boundary finally being drawn in full. It didn't feel cruel. It felt correct. I placed my napkin on the table, gently, without anger, without flourish. The small sound of fabric brushing wood carried further than I expected, a quiet punctuation to the moment. The gesture wasn't directed at anyone, but Claire flinched as though it were meant for her. The room felt still again, but differently now. Settled, grounded, honest. For the first time, I felt that my presence filled the space rather than shrinking inside it. The line had been drawn, and it didn't need defending. It stood on its own. Claire stood in front of me, her expression tense and uncertain, as if she were waiting for a verdict she couldn't shape or charm her way out of. I took a breath, calm and measured, letting the weight of the evening settle where it needed to. "Don't use me to sell things," I said quietly. My voice didn't rise, didn't shake. It simply carried the truth across the small distance between us. Claire blinked, as though the air had shifted unexpectedly. For a moment, her face softened, then tightened again, as pride and confusion collided. She seemed unsure whether to defend herself or shrink from the truth she hadn't expected me to name so plainly. She opened her mouth, reflex ready. "I was only trying to help." The sentence hung there, familiar and worn, something she'd used to smooth over countless oversteps. But it sounded thinner tonight, frayed around the edges. I shook my head gently. "No," I answered. "That's not helping." The softness in my tone wasn't for her, it was for me. Claire swallowed, her posture stiffening as she absorbed it. The denial she'd been bracing herself behind didn't seem big enough anymore. The dining room lights reflected in her eyes, catching the hint of vulnerability she tried to hide. Across the table, Ryan sat quietly, watching us with a steady focus. His elbows rested on his knees, fingers laced loosely, as though he were afraid to move, afraid to shift the fragile honesty forming between us. He said nothing, and somehow his silence felt like support instead of avoidance. His gaze flickered briefly to Claire, then back to me, offering a kind of alignment we hadn't shared all night. Claire noticed it too. Her shoulders tensed and her breath hitched, like she'd stepped into a draft she hadn't expected. The room felt impossibly still, the weight of unspoken truths gathering in the quiet. A few guests excused themselves softly, murmuring polite apologies as they gathered their things. The clatter of chairs, the rustle of handbags, and the quiet shuffle of feet crossing the floor created a gentle backdrop to the moment. None of them looked judgmental. They simply looked uncomfortable, as though they'd stumbled into a conversation meant to be private. And perhaps it was, but the truth had never been more public. Claire watched them go, a flicker of panic crossing her face as the audience she'd curated slowly dissolved. I sat still, offering her no rescue from the consequences unfolding around her. More guests stood, drifting toward the exit, with quick, polite nods. What had begun as an audience for her presentation was dissolving into fragments she no longer controlled. Claire's gaze darted toward the door, then back to me, then to Ryan, as if searching for someone willing to return the old version of the evening to her. But no one stepped forward. No one filled the silence. The weight of the moment pressed into the corners of the room, filling it with something honest. Uncomfortable, yes, but undeniably honest. A faint draft slipped through the narrow gap of the restaurant's side door, stirring the edges of the tablecloth in a whisper-soft motion. The sound brushed past us, light and cold, threading itself into the stillness. Claire didn't speak. Neither did I. The space between us held everything that needed to be said, and everything that no longer needed explanation. I breathed slowly, letting that clarity settle into me. For the first time since the evening began, I felt fully present, not overshadowed, not directed, not handled. Just present, and deeply certain of where I stood. The room had thinned to only a few guests when one of them, a woman with kind eyes and a blazer still folded neatly over her arm, approached me. She hesitated for a moment, then asked softly, "I'm sorry, I thought this was your birthday?" Her tone wasn't accusatory. It held the gentle confusion of someone who realized a line had been crossed, but didn't know how to name it. I offered her a small, tired smile. "It is," I said simply. The simplicity of those two words struck harder than any explanation could have. Her eyebrows lifted, a faint apology settling into her expression. She nodded once, squeezed my arm lightly, and stepped back. In her quiet question, something in me settled even further. Validation arriving from someone who owed me nothing. Across the room, Claire gathered her materials with trembling hands. Brochures, notebooks, pens, each item slipped into her bag with a rushed delicacy, as though she didn't want the movement to draw attention, but couldn't help the slight shake in her fingers. For the first time that night, she looked small. Not diminished, but human, stripped of performance. A heavy breath escaped her as she struggled to maintain composure. Watching her like this didn't fill me with satisfaction. If anything, there was a muted ache beneath the anger, a quiet understanding that she had built something fragile on top of good intentions that had twisted out of shape. As I watched her, a surprising wave of tenderness flickered through me. Not forgiveness, not avoidance, but a gentler recognition of the complexity in front of me. Claire had crossed boundaries, yes. She had used my life as leverage for something she wanted. But here, with her shoulders slumped and her ambition collapsing under the weight of the evening, I didn't want to crush her. I didn't want to humiliate her. I just wanted the truth acknowledged. That quiet desire pulled my breath into something softer, steadier. A part of me let go of the need to win. I only wanted peace, real peace, not the forced artificial kind she'd wrapped around tonight. Ryan moved closer, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. His presence didn't crowd, it steadied. He didn't say a word, but the small space between us felt bridged in a way it hadn't been earlier. The slight brush of his sleeve against mine was enough to signal where he stood now. Not in the middle, not appeasing both sides, but grounded beside me. We watched Claire gather her final items, her movements slow and uneven. For a moment, it felt like the three of us existed in our own suspended world. No pitch, no performance, no audience left to impress. Just the raw aftermath of choices finally being seen clearly. I lifted a glass of water, took a sip, and let it settle the remnants of emotion swirling through me. The coolness was steadying, washing down the tightness that had built in my chest. Around us, the restaurant reclaimed its natural rhythm. Laughter from another table, the clink of plates, the soft murmur of normal conversations far removed from ours. I didn't need to explain anything to those still lingering nearby. They understood enough. And in that understanding, the need to justify myself fell away. I breathed in deeply and let the heaviness ebb off me in slow, deliberate waves. Someone folded the projector and snapped its case shut with a soft click. The sound was small, almost insignificant, yet it signaled an ending that felt both literal and symbolic. The machine that had stolen the center of my birthday was packed away, reduced to a closed box on the corner of a table. I looked at it for a moment, letting the simplicity of it settle inside me. No argument, no confrontation, no final blow, just closure. Quiet, clean, and enough. I sat back in my chair, feeling more grounded than I had all evening. The unraveling was done. The server returned with the bill, holding it with both hands as if it carried more weight than paper usually did. He approached our smaller table first, placing it down gently in front of me. "For your family's portion," he said softly, his tone respectful but firm, as though he wished he could offer something more than protocol allowed. The receipt sat there, a quiet confirmation that the evening was no longer tangled with anyone else's intentions. Ryan reached for it, but I rested a hand on the folder before he could take it. "I've got it," I said, my voice steady. Paying felt right. Not out of obligation, but out of ownership. The night had been messy, chaotic, even painful. But this part belonged to me. Ryan didn't argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, watching me with a kind of soft respect that felt new, unfamiliar, and strangely comforting. I opened the folder, scanning the total. It wasn't small, but it felt clean, cleaner than anything else that had happened that night. My best friend slid her glass toward me so it wouldn't teeter near the edge, a small gesture that brought a flicker of warmth through my chest. Around us, the restaurant's normal chatter filled the air again. Our little table felt like an island pulled free from the wreckage of an evening that had tried to swallow it whole. Claire approached the same staff member with hesitant steps. When he presented her with the bill for her own setup, the larger table, the extra materials, the lingering party she had orchestrated, her hand hovered before finally taking the receipt. She blinked at the number, her composure faltering for a split second. She reached into her bag, searching for her wallet with an urgency that betrayed her shock. The pen she tried to hold shook slightly, leaving a faint scratch on the signature line before she studied it. She paid, but the moment felt less like a financial transaction and more like a quiet reckoning. Guests who remained shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to watch but unable to fully look away. Their faces held a mixture of sympathy and unease. Sympathy for the discomfort, unease from realizing they had been pulled into something unbalanced without consent. One of them stood and offered Claire a small, polite nod before leaving. Another followed soon after. The cluster around the large table dissolved into a loose scattering of chairs and unfinished drinks. I noticed the way Claire's shoulders curved inward, the pride she'd carried into the room shrinking into a fragile silence. Ryan glanced toward Claire briefly, then looked away, his jaw tightening with unspoken conflict. He wasn't cruel enough to enjoy her discomfort, but he wasn't blind enough to defend her anymore either. His fingers tapped lightly against his knee, a quiet rhythm of processing. I watched him, then looked back at my own receipt, signing it with a slow, deliberate motion. Every stroke of the pen felt like sealing a boundary, not against him, not against all the emotions tangled between us, but against a kind of chaos I wasn't willing to accept anymore. When the server picked up the signed receipts, he offered a small nod of acknowledgement, as though he recognized the shift that had taken place at both tables. As he walked away, the faint sound of paper sliding into the register blended with the ambient noise of the restaurant. There was no applause, no dramatic declaration, no grand ending, just the quiet completion of what needed to be acknowledged. I placed the pen back into its holder and set the folder aside. The weight of the evening didn't disappear, but it finally rested somewhere outside my chest. The restaurant began to empty around us, chairs scraping softly against the floor as the last few guests gathered their coats. A strange calm settled over the room, as if the chaos of earlier had been folded and put away with the used linens. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet fill the space that had been tense only moments ago. The overhead lights, now dimmed for the late hour, cast a softer glow across the tables. My best friend nudged a glass toward me, the ice clinking gently. "Now it feels like a birthday," she whispered. The corner of my mouth lifted before I even realized it. She was right. For the first time that evening, the night didn't feel like it belonged to anyone but me. Across the room, Claire sat alone at the large table, her materials packed away, her shoulders curved inward. She stared at the empty plates in front of her, the remnants of a night she had built from ambition rather than intention. There was a hollowness in her posture, not a collapse, but a quiet recognition of what she'd broken. She glanced in my direction once, quickly, then returned her gaze to the table. The distance between us was heavy but clean. I didn't turn away. I didn't harden. I simply watched her with the soft understanding that comes after disappointment finally settles into clarity. Some truths are too quiet to shout. Ryan stood and walked toward her. His steps were slow, his face marked with a tenderness I couldn't fully read. He sat beside her, not close enough to comfort, but not far enough to abandon. They spoke in low tones I couldn't hear, just the shape of words, the tilt of heads, the shifting weight of two people trying to navigate the space between loyalty and truth. Claire kept her gaze lowered, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Ryan rested his elbows on his knees, speaking with a gentleness that wasn't protective so much as honest. Whatever they were saying, it wasn't about choosing sides. It was about finally facing what had been avoided. I looked away, giving them the privacy the moment deserved. The air around our smaller table felt lighter, as if reclaimed. My best friend reached across and touched my hand lightly. "You handled that better than I would have," she said with a small smile. I laughed softly, the kind of laugh that removes a knot from the chest. I hadn't handled it perfectly. I hadn't needed to. I had simply told the truth, and somehow that was enough. The restaurant staff began wiping nearby tables, moving quietly so as not to disturb us. Their presence felt grounding, a reminder that the world hadn't stopped just because my night had almost unraveled. I noticed then how empty my hands felt. No phone buzzing, no brochure pushed in front of me, no decision I was being forced into. Just space. Quiet, uncluttered space. I rested my palms flat on the table and inhaled deeply. The candle's gentle flame reflected against the window, steady and calm. The night outside was dark but clear, streetlights glowing in the distance, like small promises I hadn't realized I needed. Ryan returned a moment later, his expression soft and tired, but relieved. He didn't explain what he'd said to Claire. He didn't need to. The way he sat down beside me told me enough. I gathered my things slowly, a deliberate, unhurried motion that felt like closing the final page of a chapter. The staff thanked us for coming, their voices warm and genuine. When I stood, Ryan rose with me, and my best friend looped her arm through mine. The large table behind us remained empty, its surface wiped clean, its earlier chaos erased. I took one last look at it, not with bitterness, not with triumph, but with a calm acknowledgement of what had been learned there. Then I turned toward the door, feeling the cool night air slide into the room as someone opened it. The night air touched my skin like a quiet balm, cool and steady after the strained warmth of the restaurant. Outside, the parking lot glowed under soft yellow lights, their halos shimmering faintly on the pavement. I paused just beyond the door, letting the calm settle into me. The echo of the evening, the projector's hum, the nervous conversations, Claire's wavering voice, drifted farther and farther away with each breath. My best friend stepped out beside me, pulling her jacket tighter, while Ryan lingered just a step behind, giving me space without retreating. For the first time all night, there was no pressure to perform, no expectation pressing at the edges of my thoughts, just the quiet honesty of what remained. Ryan moved closer, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. "I'm sorry," he said. Not rushed, not rehearsed. It was the kind of apology that came from somewhere deeper than guilt. I looked at him, noticing the weariness around his eyes, the sincerity that hadn't always found its way to the surface. "I know," I replied. I didn't add anything more. The night had carried enough words, enough explanations. Silence felt gentler now, like space rather than distance. My best friend waited by my car, offering me the small safety of presence without intrusion. Her breath formed little clouds in the air, each one dissolving before it drifted far. Behind us, the restaurant lights dimmed further as the staff prepared to close. The door made a soft thump as it shut, leaving the inside world sealed away. I turned slightly, catching one last glimpse through the glass. Claire stood alone beside the table, her bag slung over one shoulder. She wasn't angry, not visibly. She looked more like someone realizing, perhaps for the first time, how far she'd stepped over a line no one else agreed to. Her posture held a quiet disappointment, but not toward me, toward herself. She lifted her eyes briefly, saw us outside, and then looked down again. There was nothing left to say. I walked slowly toward my car, gravel shifting beneath my steps. Each footfall felt lighter, as though the evening had finally unlatched something I'd been carrying too long. At the door, I paused, with my hand on the handle. The night smelled faintly of cool earth and distant rain, grounding me in a way the noisy room never could. My best friend squeezed my shoulder before slipping into her own car, giving me a knowing smile that said everything without a single word. Ryan stood a few feet away, waiting, not pushing, not assuming, just waiting to see where the moment would land. He took one careful step toward me. "What do you need from me tonight?" he asked softly. It wasn't a plea or a promise. It was a question, a real one, stripped of expectation. I breathed in, letting the quiet settle. "Just honesty," I said. The simplicity of it felt like the true ending of the evening. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just human. Ryan nodded, his posture loosening in a way that told me he understood. No fixes, no defenses. No smoothing the edges of someone else's choices. Just truth, wherever it led us next. I opened my car door, the interior light blooming softly against the darkness. Before getting in, I looked once more at the restaurant. The dim windows, the empty tables, the pieces of the night left exactly where they needed to fall. Nothing inside belonged to me anymore. But out here, under the gentle glow of the parking lot lights, something quieter and stronger did. I slipped into the seat, closed the door, and let the silence wrap around me. The engine hummed to life, steady and sure, and as I pulled away I felt the night finally settle where it belonged, with me, whole and unclaimed. I drove away with the quiet hum of the engine settling into my bones, soft, steady, and nothing like the chaos I left behind. The restaurant lights faded in the rearview mirror until they were just distant glimmers, reminders of a night that unraveled and reshaped itself at the same time. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel defeated. I felt something far rarer, clear. For the first time in a long while, I hadn't swallowed my discomfort just to keep the peace. I hadn't softened the truth to protect someone else's pride. I had simply stood where I needed to stand and let the night show everyone, including myself, what lines needed to be drawn. And maybe that's what growing older really is. Not blowing out candles or making wishes, but learning when to reclaim the moments that matter, even when someone else tries to rewrite them. If this story made you feel something, anger, recognition, or even a small spark of courage, leave a comment below. Tell me what part stayed with you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting, quiet, honest, and exactly the kind we all need.